The millionaire went bankrupt when he returned from his trip and found his son in a difficult situation with his mother. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Let's begin. For 15 days, Robert Mitchell had been immersed in a desperate attempt to salvage what was left of his financial empire. He had traveled to China in search of investors, partners, and promises that never materialized. When he left, his image was still that of a respected businessman with solid assets and a name among the most influential in Greenwich, Connecticut, an affluent suburb of New York City. His return, however, would be to a brutally transformed reality. Upon arriving at the mansion where he lived with his wife, Eleanor, and their 7-year-old son, Matthew, the first thing he felt was the silence. Not the usual silence of an empty house, but a heavy, out-of-place silence that settled between the walls like a warning. The entrance was unlocked, but the lights remained off. As he pushed open the front door, Robert was enveloped by a faint smell of dampness and an unusual disarray in the hall. Crooked rugs, misplaced cushions, a dry glass on the table, small signs of a lack of care. He called out for them both, but received no answer. Still dazed from the fatigue of his journey, he tried to use his credit card to order some food. The transaction was declined. He tried another, with the same result. He logged into his banking app, and everything was confirmed. Frozen accounts, blocked operations, vanished investments. There was nothing left. The bankruptcy he had feared, and fought to avoid for days, had finally become a reality. However, the financial collapse quickly became the least of his problems. He went upstairs, calling for Eleanor, but the master bedroom was empty. Her clothes were still in the closet, her bags and shoes in their place, but there was no sign of her recent presence. In Matthew's room, the bed was made, the toys were organized, but there was a strange rigidity to the tidiness, as if nothing had been touched for days. He went back downstairs and moved through the house, searching for any clue. It was in the kitchen that he found a crumpled piece of paper on the granite countertop. The handwriting was Eleanor's, a single sentence. "I had no choice." It was then that a faint, muffled sound caught his attention. A subtle, almost imperceptible noise coming from the service area. He approached and realized that the old pantry was locked from the outside with a small chain. A simple padlock held the door shut. Robert broke it open with a tool he found in a nearby cabinet. Upon opening it, the dense odor of stale air hit him immediately. In the corner, under the dim light coming from a high opening in the wall, was Matthew, huddled, dirty, with sunken eyes and pale skin. The boy wasn't crying. He just looked at him, with a deep weariness in his eyes, as if he had already accepted being there for an indefinite time. Robert ran to him, scooping him into his arms, noticing the lightness that betrayed his malnutrition. He carried him out, tried to give him water, calmed him as best he could, and rushed him to Mount Sinai Hospital, the nearest and best equipped in the area. There, doctors confirmed that Matthew was dehydrated and suffering from mild to moderate malnutrition. No serious injuries were detected, but the boy showed signs of intense stress and emotional apathy. The team called in a child psychologist, and the case began to take on more complex dimensions. Robert, unable to comprehend how this had happened, tried to piece things together. Where was Eleanor? How could his wife, the woman who boasted on social media about being a dedicated mother, leave her son in such a state? "Mr. Mitchell," a female voice roused him from his thoughts. It was Dr. Lauren Evans, the physician who had handled the initial care. "Yes, that's me," he replied, quickly rising from his chair in the waiting room. "Your son is stable. We've managed to rehydrate him and have started a controlled nutrition plan. But we need to better understand what happened." Robert ran his hands through his hair, a nervous gesture that intensified in moments of stress. "Doctor, I was out of the country. I came back today and found my son like that. I don't know what happened, I swear." The doctor observed him with analytical eyes, assessing whether this was a credible story or just another case of parental negligence being covered up. "I understand." "And Matthew's mother? My wife, I don't know where she is. I only found a note. I thought maybe she had gone out to handle something, but—" He hesitated. not knowing how to explain that his world had collapsed in a matter of hours. At that moment, the child psychologist, Dr. Beatrice Miller, joined them. She was a middle-aged woman with a serene expression and a compassionate, yet professional, gaze. "Mr. Mitchell, I managed to speak with Matthew for a little while, but he's very withdrawn. He'll need time and ongoing support. What I can tell you is that, according to him, he had been in time out for several days." The words fell like a weight on Robert. Time out. What kind of time out involved locking a child in a pantry? "That's absurd," he exclaimed, louder than he intended. "Eleanor would never do that. She was always a devoted mother. But then he remembered the small changes in his wife's behavior over the past few months. How she easily got irritated with Matthew, how she complained that the boy was too spoiled, how she would sometimes lock herself in her room for hours while he looked after their son. They were signs that, in the rush of daily life and his obsession with work, he had chosen to ignore. Robert's phone buzzed. It was an Instagram notification. Eleanor had just posted a photo from a luxurious restaurant in Paris. The caption read, "New chapter, new life, a necessary restart." She was smiling radiantly, holding a glass of champagne, as if nothing was wrong, as if her son wasn't in a hospital after being locked up for days without proper food. Robert showed the photo to the doctors, who exchanged worried glances. "We need to contact Child Protective Services," said Dr. Evans. "And this is a serious case of neglect and possible abuse." The next day, Mrs. Irene, the housekeeper who had worked at the house for years, showed up at the hospital. She had called Robert's cell phone several times, frantic after learning he was back, and that Matthew was hospitalized. "Mr. Robert, I didn't know what to do," she said, tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Eleanor let me go a week after you left. She said I was spoiling the boy too much, and that she would take care of him herself. I tried calling later, but she never answered." With every word from Mrs. Irene, the puzzle came together in a clearer and more painful way. Eleanor had also dismissed the nanny, Rita, citing cost-cutting. Then she began to punish Matthew for increasingly trivial behaviors, spilling juice, making noise during her phone calls, asking for attention when she was busy with social media. "She changed a lot, Mr. Robert," Irene continued. "At first, I thought it was just stress, you traveling so much, all those bills to pay. But then, it seemed like she didn't even care anymore. She'd spend hours getting ready, go out without saying where, and come back in the middle of the night smelling of expensive perfume." As Irene spoke, Robert realized his absence had not just been physical. For years, he hadn't been truly present in his family's life. Immersed in business, accumulating wealth, he had ignored the signs that something was deeply wrong at home. 2 days later, the social worker assigned by New York's Child Protective Services, Marianne Edwards, came to speak with him. She was a woman in her early 30s with a direct gaze and an assertive way of speaking. "Mr. Mitchell, Matthew's situation is serious, but I need to better understand the family context. You claim you were unaware of what was happening in your absence, correct?" Robert nodded, feeling the weight of his guilt. "I was in China, trying to save my business. I spoke with Eleanor almost every day via video call, and she always said everything was fine. She'd show Matthew briefly. He seemed normal. And you never noticed anything strange? No sign that your son might be suffering?" The question made him reflect. There was a moment about 10 days ago when Matthew had looked downcast on the call. He had asked if everything was okay, and Eleanor quickly replied that the boy was just tired from playing a lot at the park. He had accepted the explanation without question. Marianne continued, flipping through some notes. According to the psychologist's preliminary report, Matthew shows signs of significant emotional trauma. He mentions that Mommy got very angry and that he was put in time out in the dark room because he did something bad. "What bad thing could a 7-year-old do to deserve that?" Robert questioned, feeling anger rise within him. "That's what we're trying to understand," Marianne replied. "From what Matthew has been able to express so far, it seems his mistake was knocking over a bottle of your wife's expensive perfume. He says he tried to clean it up, but ended up breaking the bottle completely. A perfume. His son had been locked in a pantry, left virtually without food, because of an accidentally broken perfume bottle. As the conversation continued, Robert's phone wouldn't stop vibrating. It was notifications from his lawyers, creditors, partners. The news of his bankruptcy had already spread. Mitchell Investments, the company he had built over 15 years, was officially in the process of Chapter 11 bankruptcy, with little chance of survival. All his assets were being inventoried for possible liquidation. The financial empire he was so proud of had completely crumbled. But none of that mattered now. Sitting beside the hospital bed where Matthew slept, watching his son's pale face and the machines monitoring his vital signs, Robert realized that his true bankruptcy had begun long before the financial crisis. He had failed as a father, as a husband, as a human being. Focused on building material wealth, he had neglected to build what truly mattered, a solid family, based on presence, not possessions. That night, after Matthew finally fell into a peaceful sleep, thanks to mild sedatives, Robert went out into the hospital corridor and allowed himself to cry. He wept for the lost time, for his misplaced priorities, for his willful blindness. He wept for the son he had almost lost to neglect, not just Eleanor's, but his own as well. When he returned to the room, he found Marianne again, who had come back to follow up on the case. "Mr. Mitchell, I know this isn't the best time, but we need to discuss the next steps. The hospital has indicated that Matthew will be discharged in 2 or 3 days, depending on his progress. Do you have a place to stay with him?" The house will probably be seized by creditors," Robert completed, with bitterness. "But I have an apartment in my mother's name, in Astoria, Queens. It's small, but comfortable. I can take Matthew there." Marianne nodded, taking notes. "And regarding your wife, do you intend to—" "File for divorce immediately," he answered, without hesitation. "And I will fight for full custody of Matthew. I will never allow him to go through something like this again." The determination in his voice was genuine. For the first time in years, Robert had absolute clarity about his priorities. It didn't matter if he had to start from scratch, if he lost status, comfort, or prestige. What mattered was rebuilding the relationship with his son and ensuring Matthew grew up in a safe and loving environment. When his phone buzzed again, Robert turned it off without even looking at who was calling. The outside world could wait. For now, his universe was confined to that hospital room and the fragile child sleeping in the bed. His son, who would need time, patience, and a great deal of love to overcome the trauma he had endured. Tomorrow would be difficult, he knew. There would be lawsuits, debts to negotiate, a complicated divorce ahead. But looking at Matthew, Robert made a silent promise. He would never again put anything, money, status, work above his son's well-being. It was time to be the father Matthew deserved and needed. From the hospital window, the lights of New York City shone brightly, as they always did. The city that never sleeps, the city of opportunities, the city that had witnessed his rise and was now watching his fall. But it would also be the city of his new beginning, a new beginning based on different values, more human and less material. The next morning, Robert woke to the gentle touch of a hand on his shoulder. He had slept in the armchair next to Matthew's bed, in an uncomfortable position that left his neck sore. "Mr. Robert?" It was Mrs. Irene again, bringing a bag with clean clothes for him and Matthew. "I grabbed a few things from the house before it's not possible to get in there anymore." He thanked her, moved by the gesture. Irene had always been more than an employee. She was practically family, though he had never really shown it. "How was his night?" she asked, looking at Matthew, who was still asleep. "Peaceful, thanks to the medication, but the doctor said he'll need psychological support for a long time." Irene shook her head, indignant. "I never imagined Mrs. Eleanor could do something like this. She always seemed to love the boy so much, always posting those beautiful photos online, showing everyone what a dedicated mother she was." "Appearances can be deceiving, Irene," Robert replied with a tired sigh. "I let myself be deceived for years. I wanted so badly to believe I had the perfect family that I ignored all the signs." At that moment, Matthew began to wake up. His eyes opened slowly, confused, until they focused on Robert and Irene. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize them, as if he were still trapped in the state of apathy in which he was found. But then his lips moved slightly. "Dad." The voice was faint, almost a whisper. Robert immediately moved closer, holding his son's small, fragile hand. "I'm here, son, and I'm not going anywhere." Matthew's eyes filled with tears, and he finally cried, a cry that had been held back for days of fear and loneliness. Robert hugged him carefully, mindful of the tubes and machines connected to the boy's body, feeling his son's tears wet his shirt. "Mommy said you weren't coming back," Matthew murmured between sobs. "She said you left because I was a very naughty boy." The words cut Robert like a blade. What kind of cruelty was this? Using his absence as a form of psychological punishment for an innocent child. "That's not true, Matthew. I only traveled for work, like I always do, and I always come back for you, because you are the most important person in the world to me." It was a truth he was only now fully understanding. Matthew had always been the most important person in his world. He had just let himself be distracted by goals that now seemed empty and meaningless. "I'm sorry, Dad," Matthew began, still sobbing. "I broke Mommy's perfume. I didn't mean to." "Shh, it wasn't your fault," Robert interrupted, stroking his son's hair. "It was an accident, Matthew, and no one ever should be punished like that for an accident. What your mother did was wrong, very wrong." As he comforted his son, Robert felt a new determination grow within him. One thing he knew for sure: Eleanor would have to answer for what she had done, not just in the divorce and custody battle, but legally. What she had done wasn't just neglect, it was abuse, and he wouldn't rest until justice was served. But for now, his only priority was helping Matthew recover, physically and emotionally. The rest could wait. Their small world in that hospital room was all that mattered at the moment. Outside, New York City continued its frantic pace, indifferent to the individual dramas unfolding in every building, in every home. But inside that room, something important was happening. A father and a son were rediscovering the true meaning of the word family. In the two-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens, a middle-class neighborhood in New York, Robert was preparing breakfast while listening to the news on the radio. 3 weeks had passed since Matthew was discharged from the hospital, and their routine was beginning to settle in this new home, so different from the luxurious mansion in Greenwich, yet strangely more welcoming. "Matthew, breakfast is ready," he called out, placing simple bread, fruit, and a glass of milk on the table. The boy appeared in the kitchen, still in his pajamas, his hair messy. He had more color in his cheeks, was less thin, but his eyes still carried a shadow of sadness that broke Robert's heart. "Good morning, Dad," he said, sitting at the table. "Do I have a session with Aunt B today?" Aunt B was what he called Dr. Beatrice, the psychologist who saw him 3 times a week. The bond between them had formed quickly, and the sessions, which were initially tense and difficult, now seemed to bring the boy some relief. "Yes, we have an appointment at 2 in the afternoon," Robert replied, "and after that, we can stop by the park, if you like." The park had become an important ritual for them. There, Matthew could play, run, feel the sun on his face, simple things that had been denied to him during those terrible days in the pantry. At first, the boy was afraid to go out, to be away from his father, as if he feared being abandoned again. But gradually, with a lot of patience, Robert was helping him regain his confidence. As they ate, Robert's phone rang. It was Paul Sampson, his lawyer, who was handling both the company's bankruptcy proceedings and the divorce and custody battle for Matthew. "Good morning, Paul. Any news?" "Yes, Robert. The hearing has been scheduled for next week, and, he hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "Eleanor is back in the country. She's hired Alvarez and Associates to represent her." Robert felt a knot in his stomach. Alvarez and Associates was one of the most expensive and powerful law firms in the country, specializing in high-profile divorce cases. How was Eleanor affording this? Were there resources left that he didn't know about? Is she going to contest custody? "Yes, and more than that, she's alleging that you are partly responsible for the situation, for having abandoned the family during your financial crisis. She's also implying that the conditions in which Matthew was found may have been exaggerated by you." Robert closed his eyes, trying to contain his rage. How could she be so cynical? The medical reports are all documented, Paul, and we have Mrs. Irene's testimony, as well as Matthew's own statements to the psychologist and Child Protective Services. I know, and all of that will be presented. But be prepared, Robert. This could get ugly. After hanging up, he noticed Matthew watching him with apprehensive eyes. The boy had developed a keen sensitivity to tension, a defense mechanism learned in the worst of times. "Is everything okay, Dad?" Robert forced a smile. "Of course it is, champ. Just boring grown-up stuff." But Matthew didn't seem convinced. He played with his food, pushing pieces of melon around his plate with his fork. It was about Mom, wasn't it? The question hung in the air, laden with anxiety. Robert hesitated. Since they left the hospital, he had avoided talking about Eleanor, following the psychologist's advice not to pressure the boy. Matthew rarely mentioned his mother, and when he did, it was almost always in the context of the timeouts or moments when she had been particularly harsh. "Yes, it was, son. Your mother is back in the country." Matthew's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Is she going to take me away?" "No, of course not," Robert hurried to assure him, holding his son's small hands in his. "You're going to stay with me, always." The promise hung in the air like a solemn oath, an oath Robert was determined to keep, no matter the cost. Later that day, in the session with Dr. Beatrice, Matthew was quieter than usual. The psychologist, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, noticed the change immediately. "You're very thoughtful today, Matthew. Do you want to tell me what's on your mind?" The boy drew in silence for a few minutes, tracing figures with colored pencils on a sheet of paper. Then, without looking up, he said, "So my mum is back." Dr. Beatrice exchanged a quick glance with Robert, who was watching the session from a corner of the room, as he always did. "And how do you feel about that?" Matthew shrugged, a gesture too adult for a 7-year-old. "I don't know. Are you scared?" she asked gently. The boy nodded, his eyes beginning to fill with tears. "What if I do something wrong again? What if she gets mad at me again?" Robert had to restrain the urge to intervene. The pain of seeing his son like this, terrified by the simple idea of making a childish mistake, was almost unbearable. "Matthew," said Dr. Beatrice, "what happened was not your fault. Breaking a perfume bottle, spilling juice, making noise, those are normal things that all children do. No child deserves to be locked up as punishment. Not one." The words seemed to be absorbed slowly by Matthew, like raindrops seeping into parched soil. "But Mom said I was very naughty, that nobody liked naughty boys." "Your mother was wrong," the psychologist replied firmly. "You are a wonderful boy, Matthew. Smart, caring, polite. We all make mistakes sometimes, grown-ups too. And you know what? That's okay. It's how we learn and grow." After the session, as they walked through the park, Robert watched Matthew playing on the swings. There were moments like this one, when he seemed like an ordinary child, free and carefree. But then, suddenly, something would change. A loud noise, a raised voice, or simply an internal thought, and the boy would retreat again as if expecting punishment at any moment. "How was the session today?" asked Laura, sitting down beside him on the bench. Laura Thompson was the social worker who had replaced Marianne on Matthew's case. She was younger, recently graduated, but she showed a genuine dedication and a sharp intelligence that Robert appreciated. "Difficult," he replied, without taking his eyes off his son. "He's scared about the possibility of seeing his mother again," Laura sighed. "That was to be expected, but we're prepared to argue that any initial contact should be supervised and limited. Considering the recent trauma, what if she gets shared custody? You know how the system often favors mothers, even in cases like this. The medical and psychological reports are very compelling, Robert, and we have your current dedication as a very strong point in our favor. You've reorganized your entire life around Matthew's well-being. That counts for a lot." It was true. Robert had completely transformed his routine. While trying to manage the chaos of his business failure, selling personal assets he still owned, negotiating with creditors, seeking some consulting work he could do remotely, he made sure to be present for his son at all important moments. He took Matthew to and from school, which was now just 3 blocks from their apartment. He prepared meals, read stories before bed, helped with homework. Simple, everyday things he had previously delegated to staff or to Eleanor. "You know what's ironic, Laura," he said with a sad smile. "I'm bankrupt, living in an apartment that's a tenth the size of my old house, working twice as hard to earn a third of what I used to, and I've never felt so fulfilled." Laura smiled. "That's called having a purpose, as Robert. It's different from just having success." At that moment, Matthew came running towards them, his cheeks flushed from the exercise. "Dad, can I have some ice cream? There's a cart over there." "Of course, champ, let's go." As they walked hand in hand towards the ice cream vendor, Robert felt a wave of gratitude. Despite everything, despite the pain and the struggle, he had his son by his side, and that was more wealth than all the zeros in his bank account had ever represented. The following week, the apartment in Astoria was especially tidy. Robert had cleaned everything, organized Matthew's toys, and made sure the fridge was stocked with healthy food. It was the day of the inspection visit from Child Protective Services, part of the evaluation process for the custody hearing. "You don't need to be nervous," said Laura, who had arrived early to guide him. "We're not looking for perfection, just a healthy and stable environment for Matthew." But Robert couldn't help the anxiety, the idea that someone might, for any reason, consider that he wasn't providing the best for his son was terrifying. The inspection went smoothly. The CPS caseworker, Mrs. Josephine Carter, a stern but fair-looking older woman, walked through each room, made notes, spoke briefly with Matthew alone, and seemed satisfied with what she saw. "The report will be positive, Mr. Mitchell," she said at the end. "The effort you've made to provide stability for your son, despite the difficult circumstances, is evident." After she left, Robert allowed himself to breathe a sigh of relief. One more hurdle cleared in the battle that lay ahead. "See? I told you not to worry," Laura commented, preparing to leave as well. "Thank you for everything, Laura. I don't know what I would do without your help." She smiled, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. "I'm just doing my job. But I must admit this case has become special to me, seeing Matthew progress, seeing you reinvent yourself as a father. It's why I chose this profession." After she left, Robert busied himself preparing dinner, while Matthew did his homework at the kitchen table. It was a simple, routine domestic scene, but one that held deep meaning for both of them. "Dad," Matthew called out without looking up from his notebook, "is Mom going to be at the hearing tomorrow?" The question caught Robert off guard. "Yes, son. She'll be there." "Will I have to talk to her?" "No, you don't have to go to the hearing. You'll be at school as usual, and then Mrs. Irene will pick you up." Matthew nodded, looking relieved. Mrs. Irene, though no longer officially working for them, had offered to help whenever possible. She was one of the few connections to the past that brought comfort, not anxiety. What if the judge says I have to go live with her? Robert dropped the spoon he was using to stir the sauce and knelt beside his son, looking him in the eyes. "That's not going to happen, Matthew. I promise. I will do everything possible to make sure you stay with me." The boy hugged his father tightly, as if afraid he might disappear at any moment. That night, after putting Matthew to bed, Robert sat in the dark living room, mentally reviewing every detail of the case. The medical evidence, the testimonies, the psychological evaluations, everything pointed to Eleanor's gross negligence. But he knew the American judicial system. He knew how processes could drag on for years, how skilled lawyers could twist facts, how judges could have unconscious biases. His phone buzzed with a message from Paul. "Eleanor gave an interview to The Moment of Truth today. It airs tomorrow night." Robert felt a chill. The Moment of Truth was a sensationalist show that loved to exploit family dramas. What was Eleanor planning with this? To create a favorable public narrative before the hearing. He spent a restless night with a bad feeling about what was to come, and unfortunately his instincts proved correct. The next morning, as he dropped Matthew off at school, he noticed curious glances from other parents. Some looked away as he approached, others whispered. On his way to the courthouse, his phone didn't stop ringing. Friends, former colleagues, even journalists, all wanting his side of the story. Apparently, clips of Eleanor's interview had been leaked online, and she had told a completely distorted story, According to her version, Robert was an absent father, obsessed with money, who had put the family at risk with irresponsible investments. When he realized he was going bankrupt, he fled to China, leaving her alone to deal with threats from creditors and a problematic son who had uncontrollable anger issues. The timeout had been just a brief period in his room, which Robert, in his paranoia, had turned into a story of abuse to punish her for asking for a divorce. It was a narrative so far from the truth it bordered on the absurd, but it had just enough plausible elements. His trip amidst the crisis, his frequent absence during his years of business success, to plant seeds of doubt in the public's mind. Arriving at the courthouse, Robert was met by a small crowd of reporters and cameras. Eleanor had already turned the case into a media spectacle. "Robert, do you have a response to your ex-wife's accusations? Is it true you fled the country when you learned of the bankruptcy? Why are you making up stories of abuse? Is it revenge for the divorce?" The questions came from all sides, aggressive, based on lies. Robert kept his head down, not answering, as Paul guided him into the building. "Don't say a word," the lawyer instructed. "We'll handle this inside the courtroom, with evidence, not with shows for the media." In the antechamber, Robert finally saw Eleanor. She was impeccably dressed in a discreet white suit that suggested innocence and vulnerability. Beside her, a team of 3 lawyers from Alvarez and Associates spoke in low voices. When their eyes met, Robert searched hers for any sign of remorse, any spark of the woman he had once loved and built a family with. But all he saw was coldness and determination. "Robert," Paul called. Breaking his trance, "The judge is ready for us. Remember, stay calm, answer only what you're asked, and trust the process. We have the truth on our side." The truth? Would it be enough? The courtroom was smaller and simpler than Robert had imagined. Judge Eliza Perry, assigned to the case, was a middle-aged woman with a stern expression and a sharp gaze. After the initial formalities, she made it clear she would not tolerate the media circus forming around the case. "I want to make something very clear," she said, looking directly at Eleanor and her lawyers. "This is not a reality show. It is a serious proceeding involving the well-being of a child. Any attempt to manipulate public opinion or pressure this court through the media will be viewed with extreme severity." Eleanor's lawyers seemed momentarily flustered, but quickly regained their confident posture. The hearing began with the presentation of the medical reports from Mount Sinai Hospital, documenting Matthew's condition when he was found: moderate dehydration, mild malnutrition, signs of acute stress. The written testimony of Dr. Lauren Evans was read, detailing the boy's physical and emotional state. Next came the psychologist's report from Dr. Beatrice, presenting evidence of significant emotional trauma. Eleanor's defense tried to discredit the reports, suggesting that Robert might have exaggerated the symptoms when he took his son to the hospital, or that the boy himself, being emotionally unstable, might be fabricating stories to please his father. "Your Honor," intervened Eleanor's lead attorney, "Richard Alvarez, we are not denying that the boy went through a difficult period. But it's important to contextualize. Mr. Mitchell abandoned his family at the most critical moment, leaving my client alone to face threats from creditors and care for a son with a history of behavioral problems. If Mrs. Mitchell made an error in judgment regarding discipline, it was the result of extreme stress and lack of support." Robert felt his blood boil, but remained outwardly calm. As Paul had advised, "Mr. Alvarez," the judge replied, "we are talking about a 7-year-old child locked in a pantry for days. This goes far beyond an error in judgment regarding discipline." The hearing continued with the testimony of Mrs. Irene, who described how Eleanor had changed in the preceding months, becoming more irritable with her son, more obsessed with appearances, more emotionally absent. She spoke of how she and the nanny were dismissed, and how Eleanor began to punish Matthew for increasingly trivial behaviors. When it was Robert's turn to testify, he spoke with sincerity about his own failings as a father, the constant travel, prioritizing work, his willful blindness to the problems at home. But he also described in detail what he found upon returning from China, his son's condition, the note left by Eleanor, her social media posts while Matthew was locked up and hungry. The most impactful moment, however, came when Paul presented a set of evidence that Eleanor and her lawyers had not expected: screenshots of Eleanor's social media posts during the period Matthew was trapped in the pantry. There were photos of her at expensive restaurants, at parties, at a luxury spa, always smiling, always elegant, with no sign of concern. "How do you explain," the judge asked Eleanor directly, "that while your son was locked at home, without proper care, you were at a spa in the Berkshires, posting photos of beauty treatments?" Eleanor hesitated, glancing quickly at her lawyers. I needed a moment for myself, Your Honor. I was overwhelmed, emotionally exhausted, and Matthew wasn't locked up for that whole time. It was just a one-time punishment. A one-time punishment that resulted in dehydration and malnutrition? The judge did not seem convinced. "And who was looking after your son while you were taking a moment for yourself?" He's an independent boy. He knew where the food was. He could help himself." The answer caused murmurs in the room. The idea that a 7-year-old should fend for himself for days was absurd. At the end of the hearing, Judge Perry announced she would make a decision within a week, after reviewing all the evidence and testimonies. For now, temporary custody would remain with Robert, and any contact between Eleanor and Matthew would have to be supervised. Leaving the courthouse, Robert was again surrounded by journalists. This time, Paul allowed him to make a brief statement. "I am here only as a father, fighting for the well-being of my son. I trust in the justice system and ask for respect for Matthew's privacy at this delicate time. He is just a child who has been through a traumatic experience and deserves peace to recover." On the way to pick up his son from school, Robert reflected on how life could change so drastically in a few weeks. A month ago, he was a successful businessman, married to a socialite, living a life of appearances in a Greenwich mansion. Now he was a bankrupt man in the midst of a public and scandalous divorce, living in a modest apartment, fighting for custody of his traumatized son. But strangely, he had never felt so authentic, so connected to what truly mattered. The money, the status, the image, it had all proven to be a fragile illusion. The real value was in the simple moments with Matthew, the bedtime stories, the shared drawings, the shy smile that was beginning to appear more frequently on the boy's face. When he arrived at the school, he found Matthew waiting in the yard, talking to a girl his age. Robert's heart warmed to see his son interacting socially, a sign that, slowly, he was regaining the confidence he had lost. "Hi, Dad," Matthew exclaimed upon seeing him, running in his direction with an energy that had seemed impossible weeks ago. "This is Julia, my friend from class." Robert greeted the girl with a smile, observing how Matthew seemed lighter, more like a child, in that moment. "Ready to go home, champ." Matthew nodded, taking his father's hand. On the way, he talked about his day, about science class, about a drawing he had made. Small things, normal conversations that for any other parent might seem trivial, but for Robert represented monumental achievements. At home, while they prepared a simple snack together, Robert's phone rang. It was Laura, the social worker. "Robert, the judge has requested one final report before making her decision. Can I stop by tomorrow for an informal visit? I want to see how Matthew is adapting to the new school, the new routine." "Of course, Laura. Come whenever is best for you." After hanging up, Robert noticed Matthew watching him with a worried expression. "Dad, what if Mom wins? What if I have to go with her?" The question, asked in a trembling voice, revealed the fear that still haunted the boy. Robert knelt to be at his son's eye level, holding his small hands between his own. "Matthew, I promise I will do everything in my power to make sure you stay with me. But whatever happens, never doubt one thing. I love you more than anything in this world, and I will always be here for you, no matter what." The boy hugged his father tightly as if to cling to that promise, and in that embrace, Robert felt both the weight of responsibility and the strength of the love that united them. A bond that no court decision, no media campaign, no lie could ever break. A week after the hearing, Robert and Matthew were sitting on the living room couch watching a cartoon when the phone rang. It was Paul and his lawyer. "I just received the judge's decision," he said, his tone not revealing the outcome. "Do you want me to read it now? Or would you prefer to come to the office?" "Read it now, please," Robert requested, his heart pounding. Instinctively, he pulled Matthew closer, as if he could shield him from any bad news. There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling, and then Paul's voice returned, now with a hint of satisfaction. "The judge has granted you sole legal and physical custody of Matthew Cheech, Robert. Eleanor will only have rights to supervised visits every other week, which can only occur after she completes a family therapy and parental guidance program." Robert closed his eyes, feeling a wave of relief so intense it almost made him dizzy. "And is the decision final?" "She can appeal, of course, but the grounds for the decision are solid." The judge was particularly scathing about the evidence of neglect and Eleanor's subsequent behavior, which showed more concern for her public image than for her son's well-being. After thanking Paul and hanging up, Robert turned to Matthew, who was watching him with curious eyes. "Good news, son. The judge decided that you're going to keep living with me." Matthew's face lit up with a smile that Robert hadn't seen in a long time, a smile without reservation, without shadows, purely childlike. "Forever. Yes, champ. You and me. Together." The boy jumped off the couch and hugged his father tightly. "And Mom." Robert chose his words carefully. Despite everything Eleanor had done, she was still Matthew's mother, and he didn't want to foster resentment or fear. "Your mum will be able to visit you sometimes, but only when she's better, and there will always be someone else there to make sure everything is okay." Matthew nodded, seeming to accept this explanation. For a child who had been through so much, he showed a surprising capacity for adaptation. "Should we celebrate?" Robert suggested. "We can order that pizza you like." Dinner that night was almost festive. Seated at the simple table in their Astoria apartment, father and son talked, laughed, and made plans for the future. It was as if a weight had been lifted, allowing them both to breathe freely for the first time in a long time. After putting Matthew to bed, Robert sat in the living room, absorbing the magnitude of the moment. He had won the legal battle, but he knew the journey was just beginning. Matthew still had a long road of emotional recovery ahead, and he himself needed to rebuild his professional life, to find a new purpose beyond his failed company. His phone buzzed with a message from Laura. "Heard about the decision. Congratulations. You both deserve this chance." Robert smiled, grateful for all the support they had received. Laura, Dr. Beatrice, Mrs. Irene, Paul, each in their own way, had been crucial on this journey. The next morning, while dropping Matthew off at school, Robert noticed that the other parents' gazes had changed. There were no more whispers or judgmental expressions, but rather nods, discreet smiles, even a few words of support. The truth about the case had spread, overcoming the distorted narrative Eleanor had tried to build. On his way to a job interview, a consulting position at a mid-sized company, nothing comparable to his former status, but a necessary start, Robert stopped at a coffee shop. That's when he saw, on the television hanging on the wall, Eleanor's face. She was giving another interview, this time to a more sober morning show. Her demeanor was different, less makeup, a more restrained expression, a softer voice. A calculated transformation, no doubt. "I made mistakes, yes," she said, with teary eyes that seemed rehearsed. "I was going through a period of great stress, feeling abandoned, overwhelmed with financial problems I didn't create. But I love my son more than anything, and I am committed to doing whatever it takes to regain his trust and his love." Robert watched with a mixture of disgust and pity as she now presented herself as a repentant woman willing to change. Had Eleanor truly realized the gravity of what she had done, or was it just another strategy to preserve her public image? 10 days later, while organizing some documents in the small makeshift office in the corner of the living room, Robert received an unexpected call. It was Regina Alvarez, the founding partner of the law firm representing Eleanor. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for taking my call. I know I'm being bold by contacting you directly, but I believe we can avoid further strain for everyone involved." Robert frowned, suspicious. "What is this about, Ms. Alvarez?" "Eleanor will not be appealing the custody decision." The statement took Robert by surprise. Knowing his ex-wife, he had expected a long and grueling battle. "Instead," the lawyer continued, "she proposes a settlement. She will strictly adhere to the court's orders regarding therapy and parental guidance. In return, she asks that you agree to a joint press release stating that you are both focused on Matthew's well-being and working to overcome past issues. Robert thought for a moment. He owed Eleanor nothing after what she had done, but a continued public battle would only harm Matthew, who had already suffered enough. "All right," he finally replied, "but on one condition. Eleanor needs to make a personal statement to Matthew, taking full responsibility for what she did, without excuses or justifications. Not a public apology for the cameras, but something private between her and her son when he is ready for it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I will convey your condition." 3 days later, at the first supervised visit, Matthew would see Eleanor for the first time since the traumatic events. The visit would take place at Dr. Beatrice's office, with the psychologist present the entire time. Robert was more nervous than his son. Sitting in the waiting room, he noticed Matthew's restless leg, but his face remained surprisingly calm. "Are you sure you're ready for this, son? We can postpone it if you prefer." Matthew looked at his father with an expression that seemed older than his 7 years. "Aunt Bee said it will be okay, Dad, and I want to ask Mom some things." Robert nodded, respecting his son's decision. In the last few therapy sessions, Dr. Beatrice had worked with Matthew to prepare him for this moment, helping him express his questions, his fears, his confusion. When the door opened and Eleanor entered, accompanied by Dr. Beatrice, Robert felt Matthew squeeze his hand tighter. Eleanor looked different. Simpler hair, discreet clothing, less makeup. Her eyes avoided Robert and went straight to her son. "Hi, Matthew," she said, her voice soft. The boy didn't answer right away. He observed his mother as if trying to reconcile two different images, the mother who had locked him in the pantry, and the woman now standing before him, seemingly transformed. "I'll leave you now," Robert said, getting up. "I'll be right outside, okay, son?" Matthew nodded, slowly releasing his father's hand. Dr. Beatrice gave Robert a reassuring smile, silently promising to take good care of Matthew during this delicate encounter. In the waiting room, Robert paced back and forth, unable to stand still. He checked the clock every minute, worried about what was happening inside. How was Matthew reacting? What was Eleanor saying? Was she truly committed to making amends with her son, or was it all part of a strategy to look better in the eyes of the court and the public? 40 minutes later, which felt like 40 hours, the door finally opened. Matthew came out first, followed by Dr. Beatrice and Eleanor. The boy's face was serious, but not distressed. He went straight to his father, taking his hand. "How was it, champ?" Robert asked, kneeling to be at his son's eye level. "It was okay," Matthew replied, with that incredible conciseness that children possess. "Mom said she's sorry, and I told her I was very sad about what she did." Robert looked over his son's shoulder and saw Eleanor standing a few feet away, her eyes glistening with tears. This time, genuinely, Dr. Beatrice approached Robert. "It was a good first step," she said in a low voice. Matthew was able to express his feelings, and Eleanor listened without defending or justifying herself. "We'll continue to work on it, step by step." After Eleanor left, Robert and Matthew walked to a nearby park. The boy was quieter than usual, certainly processing everything that had happened. "Do you want to talk about what you discussed in there?" Robert asked, careful not to press. Matthew shrugged, kicking a small stone on the path. "Mom cried a lot. She said she's taking some medicine to make her head better." "That's good," Robert commented, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups need help too when they're not feeling well. She asked if I wanted to go live with her again after she gets better." Robert felt a knot in his stomach. "And what did you say?" "That I want to stay with you," Matthew said, looking up with sincere eyes. "Because with you, I feel safe." The simple words hit Robert like a thunderbolt. Safety. Something so basic, so fundamental that every child deserved. Something Matthew was only now regaining, after all he had been through. "I will always keep you safe, Matthew." Always. Weeks turned into months, and a new normality settled into the lives of the father and son. Robert had secured the consulting job, and while the salary was much lower than he was used to, it was enough to maintain a comfortable, if modest, life. Matthew continued his therapy sessions, now reduced to once a week, and showed remarkable progress. The nightmares had subsided. He was more sociable at school, less anxious in new situations. The supervised visits with Eleanor continued, now in less clinical settings. A park, a children's diner, sometimes a bookstore, always with the presence of a professional appointed by the court, but in places that allowed for more natural interactions between mother and son. Robert observed, with a mixture of caution and hope, Eleanor's efforts to rebuild her relationship with Matthew. She seemed genuinely committed to her psychological treatment and had adopted a more discreet lifestyle, away from social media and the spotlight. On a Sunday afternoon, after one of these visits, Robert and Matthew were walking home when the boy asked an unexpected question. "Dad, do you still love Mom?" The question caught Robert off guard. He stopped walking, searching for the most honest and appropriate answer. "Love between grown-ups is complicated, son. Your mom and I went through some very difficult things together, but there's a kind of love that never changes, and that's the love we feel for you. Even when your mom did wrong things, I'm sure that deep down, she never stopped loving you." Matthew considered the answer for a moment, processing the words with a seriousness that sometimes appeared on his childish face. "I think I still love Mom," he said finally. "Even though I was really mad at her," Robert smiled, moved by the capacity for forgiveness that only children possess. "And it's okay to feel that, Matthew. You can love someone even when they make mistakes." That night, after putting Matthew to bed, Robert received a call from Paul. His lawyer had scheduled a meeting with the representatives of the creditors of Mitchell Investments, his former company. There was a settlement offer on the table that would allow Robert to pay off a significant portion of the debts without losing everything he still owned. "It's a chance to start over with a bit more stability," Paul explained. "It won't be easy, but you can finally turn this page." Robert thanked him and, after hanging up, reflected on how his life had completely changed in less than a year. From the mansion in Greenwich to the apartment in Astoria, from luxury to simplicity, from status to anonymity, but also from absence to presence, from superficiality to authenticity, from emptiness to fulfillment. His phone buzzed again. It was a message from Laura, the social worker. "We need to talk. Can you meet me tomorrow at the coffee shop near your work?" The tone of the message caused some apprehension in Robert. What could be so urgent? The next day, while waiting for Laura at the coffee shop, Robert couldn't help but imagine pessimistic scenarios. Had Eleanor made some new legal maneuver? Was there a problem with Matthew's psychological evaluations? Laura arrived with her usual serene smile, but there was something different in her eyes, a kind of restrained excitement. "Thanks for coming, Robert," she said, sitting across from him. "I have some news that could be very significant for you both." She opened her folder and took out a colorful brochure. "It's about a pilot program the family court is implementing in partnership with some NGOs. It's called New Beginnings, and it's aimed at families who have gone through traumas similar to yours." Robert examined the brochure with curiosity. It was a program that combined family therapy, recreational activities, and even support for re-entering the job market, all focused on families that had faced situations of abuse, neglect, or abandonment. "I thought of you immediately," Laura continued. "Matthew has made incredible progress, but there are still unresolved issues. And you, Robert, well, you've been an exemplary father, but you've also been through a lot of trauma." "Me?" Robert seemed surprised. "But I wasn't the victim here." Laura leaned slightly over the table, her expression serious. "Trauma isn't a competition, Robert. You lost your company, saw your marriage fall apart, discovered your wife was capable of cruelty to her own son, and had to rebuild your life from scratch. That leaves marks. And sometimes, when we're so focused on being strong for our children, we don't realize how much we need care ourselves." The words hit Robert deeper than he expected. It was true that amidst everything there had been little room to process his own emotions. The priority was always Matthew, as it should be. But there were nights when, alone after his son fell asleep, he felt exhausted not just physically, but emotionally. There were questions that still haunted him. How did I not see what was happening? How did I marry someone capable of such cruelty? What did I do wrong? The program lasts 6 months, Laura explained. There are weekly meetings, activities for parents and children together, and also separate sessions. It doesn't interfere with Matthew's school or your work. The meetings are on weekends or in the evenings. And Eleanor, Robert asked, concerned about potential conflicts. The program accommodates different family configurations. In your case, it would focus on the father-son relationship, without forcing Matthew to interact with his mother more than what's established in the supervised visits. But if, at some point, Matthew expresses a desire to have his mother involved in a specific activity that can be considered, always with the proper professional support. Robert reread the brochure, thoughtful. There was resistance within him, a part that said they were fine, that they had already overcome the worst, that they didn't need more interventions. But another, wiser part recognized that healing wasn't an event, but an ongoing process. "I need to talk to Matthew before I decide," he said finally. "Of course," Laura agreed. "In fact, that's part of the process. The program only works with the voluntary engagement of all participants, including the children." That evening, during dinner, Robert introduced the topic simply in a way appropriate for Matthew's age. "Son, Laura told me about a program where families like ours, just you and me, or sometimes other people too, meet to do activities together, talk about things that happened and learn new things. What do you think?" Matthew thoughtfully chewed his pasta before answering. "Are there other kids there?" "Yes, other kids who have also been through tough times at home, like you." The boy seemed to seriously consider the idea. "And do they get sad sometimes too? Or scared?" "Probably, yes. And it's okay to feel that way. It's part of healing on the inside, you know?" Matthew nodded as if he understood perfectly. "I want to go, Dad." The simplicity of the answer moved Robert. His son, so young and already so resilient, was more open to the idea of seeking help than many adults. The following week, they attended the first session of the New Beginnings program, held in a welcoming community center in the Park Slope neighborhood of Brooklyn. There were 5 other families, all with different stories, but united by a common denominator. They had been through some kind of traumatic rupture and were now in the process of rebuilding. The group's main facilitator, Dr. Andrew Silverman, was a middle-aged man with a calm voice and a captivating way of addressing both adults and children. He began by explaining the program's dynamics. There would be moments for joint activities, moments for separate groups, adults on one side, children on the other, and also individual sessions when necessary. "We are here to learn from each other," he explained. "Each family has its unique story, its specific challenges, but there is something we all share, the courage to be here, to seek a better path, to recognize that we need support on this journey. And that, my friends, is already a huge victory." The first activity was simple. Each family had to create a coat of arms that represented their values, their hopes, their qualities as a unit. Sitting at a table with colored paper, markers, and other art supplies, Robert and Matthew talked about what to include. "I think we should put a book," Matthew suggested, "because you always read stories to me before bed, even when you're really tired." Robert smiled, touched by the observation. It was true. No matter how exhausting the day had been, the bedtime story routine was sacred. "And how about a soccer ball?" Robert added. "Because we play together every Sunday in the park," Matthew agreed enthusiastically, drawing with care. Then, after a moment of reflection, he added something that surprised Robert: a heart broken in half, with the pieces being joined by small stitches, like a seam. "What's that, son?" "It's our heart," the boy explained, with profound simplicity. "It broke, but we're fixing it." Robert swallowed hard, feeling his eyes burn. How could a 7-year-old have such a keen perception, such a poetic way of expressing what they were living through? Around them, other families were also creating their coats of arms, each reflecting different stories. A single mother with twin girls who had escaped an abusive father. A pair of grandparents raising their grandson after their daughter became addicted to drugs. A widowed father trying to reconnect with his teenage son after years of a distant relationship. Distinct stories, unique pains, but all united by the same purpose: to heal, to rebuild, to move forward. At the end of the session, each family briefly presented their coat of arms. When it was Robert and Matthew's turn, the boy wanted to personally explain the meaning of each symbol they had drawn. His childish voice, once shy, now sounded clear and confident as he described the heart in the process of being mended. "Sometimes it hurts a little," he said, looking at the drawing, "but it's getting stronger because of the new stitches." Dr. Andrews smiled, visibly touched. "What you've described, Matthew, has a name. It's called resilience. It's the ability to heal and become even stronger after something painful. And you know what? You've shown a lot of resilience." On the way home, Matthew was excited, talking about the other children he had met, about the activities they would do in the upcoming meetings. Robert listened with a full heart, grateful to see his son progressing, regaining his ability to be enthusiastic, to look to the future with hope. "Dad," Matthew said suddenly, as they climbed the stairs to their building, "I think Mum has a broken heart too." Robert stopped, surprised by the observation. "Why do you say that, son?" "Because she cries a lot when she visits me, and sometimes, when she thinks I'm not looking, she stares at a picture of us from when I was a baby." Matthew's perception was striking, and probably true. Regardless of what had motivated Eleanor's terrible actions, it was undeniable that she was also suffering from the consequences of her actions, from the loss of her son, from the collapse of the life she knew. "You're right, Matthew," Robert answered honestly. "Your mom is going through a difficult time too, and she needs the right kind of help to deal with it. Like us in the New Beginnings program. Something like that. She's in therapy, talking to people who can help her understand why she did what she did and how she can get better." Matthew was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. Then, with a wisdom that sometimes emerged unexpectedly, he said, "I hope she can fix her heart too." Robert hugged his son, moved by his capacity for compassion, even after everything he had suffered. "I hope so too, son. I hope so too." That night, after Matthew fell asleep, Robert sat on the small apartment balcony, watching the city lights. New York shone in the distance, immense and indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding in its millions of homes. And yet, in every lit window, stories like theirs were being lived, stories of loss and new beginnings, of pain and healing, of falls and redemptions. For the first time in a long time, Robert allowed himself to cry, not out of despair, not out of anger, but from a complex emotion that mixed relief, hope, and a kind of melancholic gratitude. Gratitude for having found his son in time, for having the chance to rebuild their lives together, for discovering in the most painful way possible what truly mattered. The next morning, Robert woke to the sound of Matthew humming in the kitchen. The boy had gotten up early and was trying to make breakfast: slightly burnt toast, chocolate milk, a banana cut into uneven slices, a breakfast made with childish love, imperfect and completely perfect at the same time. "Good morning, Dad," Matthew exclaimed, proud of his creation. "I made breakfast for you." Robert smiled, feeling the simple happiness that only small, everyday achievements can bring. "It looks great, champ. Thank you." As they ate together, Robert watched his son, noticing how he seemed lighter, more like a child. The New Beginnings program seemed to be having a positive effect, even after just one meeting. Or perhaps it was just the accumulation of all the small steps they had taken together over the past few months: the therapy, the new school, the stable routine, the unconditional love. "Dad," Matthew called, pulling Robert from his thoughts. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, son." "What is it?" "We're going to be okay, right?" The question, so simple and so profound at the same time, touched Robert in a way he hadn't expected. It was the first time Matthew had verbalized this concern for the future, this need for reassurance. "Yes, Matthew, we're going to be okay," he replied, holding his son's hand across the table. "It might not always be easy. There might be tough days ahead. But together, we're going to be okay." And, looking into his son's trusting eyes, Robert realized he wasn't just saying what the child needed to hear. He was expressing a truth that, finally, he himself was beginning to believe. They really were going to be okay. That afternoon, after his shift at the new job, Robert received an unexpected call. It was the principal of Matthew's school, Mr. Gilbert. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to talk about a situation that occurred today with Matthew. Nothing serious, don't worry, but something I felt was important to share personally." Robert felt that instinctive knot in his stomach that every parent knows when they get an unexpected call from school. What happened? In class today, we asked the students to write an essay on real-life heroes. Most of the children wrote about firefighters, doctors, police officers. Matthew wrote about you. Mr. Gilbert's voice had a tone of restrained emotion that made Robert hold his breath. He described how you found him when he was going through that difficult situation, how you saved him, how you rearranged your life to take care of him, how you're always present despite all the problems. It was such an honest and moving essay that our English teacher, Mrs. Clara, had to leave the room to compose herself. Robert closed his eyes, feeling a wave of emotion so intense he could barely speak. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything, Mr. Mitchell. I just wanted you to know that, in your son's eyes, you are a hero, and, if I may be so bold, in the eyes of our school staff as well. Matthew's progress since he arrived here has been extraordinary, and much of that is due to the safe and loving environment you have provided for him." After hanging up, Robert remained seated at his desk, unable to return to work. The principal's words reverberated in his mind, stirring a mix of pride and humility. A hero. He didn't feel like one. He had just done what any father should do: protect, love, be present. And yet, that simplicity seemed to have made all the difference for Matthew. At the end of the day, when he picked up his son from school, Robert hugged him tighter than usual, without mentioning the essay. That would be a secret between him and the principal, a reminder for the tougher days that in his son's eyes, he was doing the right thing. "Everything okay, Dad?" Matthew asked, noticing something different in the hug. "Everything's perfect, son," Robert replied. "I'm just happy to be here with you." And as they walked home together, down the tree-lined street in Astoria, Robert thought that perhaps true wealth was never in the material possessions he had accumulated and lost, but in these simple moments, a hug, a small hand in his, the trust in his son's eyes, the chance to start over and build something real, something that no bankruptcy could ever take from him. Dr. Beatrice smiled. Matthew has an extraordinary heart, and he was lucky to have a father who, even in the midst of his own suffering, knew how to protect that heart, nurture it and help it heal. The psychologist's words stayed with Robert in the days that followed, echoing in his mind as he dealt with the small and large decisions of daily life, protecting his son's heart, not just from physical danger, but also from the resentment, fear and distrust that could have taken root after the trauma. It was an immense responsibility, but also a privilege. On a Saturday morning, as they were having breakfast, Matthew asked a question that took Robert by surprise. "Dad, can we invite Mom to have lunch here at our house for my birthday?" Matthew's 8th birthday was approaching, and Robert was planning a small celebration with friends from school and the New Beginnings program. But the idea of including Eleanor in an event at their home, the safe space they had built together, had not crossed his mind. "You want her to come here?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Matthew nodded, distractedly stirring his cereal. "She's never been here, and I wanted everyone I liked to be at my birthday." Robert watched his son, amazed at his ability to compartmentalize experiences. To Matthew, the mother who had locked him in the pantry and the mother who now visited regularly, took him on outings and showed genuine interest in his life, were almost different people. And perhaps in a way, they were. "All right, son. If that's what you want, we can invite your mother." The smile that lit up Matthew's face was reward enough for any discomfort Robert might feel. On the day of the birthday, the small apartment in Astoria was decorated with balloons and colorful banners. The other children would arrive later for the party itself, but Robert had reserved lunch for a more intimate moment, just the three of them. When the doorbell rang, Matthew ran to answer it, excited. Eleanor was at the door, holding a beautifully wrapped gift and a bouquet of flowers. Not for her son, Robert realized as she entered, but for the home. "Thank you for inviting me," she said, handing the flowers to Robert with a hesitant smile. "I thought it would be appropriate." "They're beautiful," he replied, accepting the peace offering. "I'll put them in water." While Matthew eagerly unwrapped his present, a collection of children's books about the explorers and scientists he so admired, Robert prepared the final details of the lunch in the small kitchen. He had made his son's favorite dish, homemade lasagna, from a recipe he had learned from his own late mother. "Can I help with anything?" Eleanor asked, timidly approaching the kitchen. Robert hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "You can finish preparing the salad if you like." Side by side, working in a confined space, the two maintained a careful cordiality, like dancers performing rehearsed steps. They were no longer a couple, not even friends, but they were trying to be something equally valuable. Parents who could cooperate for the good of their child. Lunch went better than either of them could have expected. Matthew, radiant at the center of attention, told animated stories about school, his friends, his plans for the future. Robert and Eleanor listened, asked questions, laughed at the right times, a semblance of a family that, for a few hours, felt almost real. When they finished dessert, a chocolate cake Matthew had helped make the day before, the boy looked at his parents with a serious, almost solemn expression. "This is the best birthday of my life," he declared, with the conviction only children possess. Robert and Eleanor exchanged a brief glance, a silent communication that expressed so much surprise, gratitude, a hint of sadness for what might have been if things had been different. "I'm glad you're enjoying it, champ," Robert said, ruffling his son's hair. "Me too, my love," Eleanor added, her voice soft. "And you still have the party with your friends later." After lunch, while Matthew organized his presents in his room, Robert and Eleanor were left alone in the living room for a few minutes. The silence between them was less tense than before, filled not with anger, but with a sort of melancholic nostalgia. "You've done a wonderful job with him, Robert," Eleanor said finally. "This place, the life you've built together, it's exactly what he needs." "He needs both of us," Robert replied, surprising himself with the words. "In different ways, at different times. But he needs both of us." Eleanor nodded, her eyes shining with restrained tears. "I never thought I'd say this, but thank you for not giving up on me completely, for giving Matthew the chance to have a mother, even after what I did." Robert sighed, looking out the window at the New York sky, surprisingly blue that day. "It wasn't an easy decision, Eleanor, and it still isn't, sometimes. But I see how you've been trying, how consistent you've been, how happy Matthew is when he comes back from outings with you." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to completely forgive what happened, but I know that holding on to anger and resentment would only hurt all of us, especially Matthew. So I'm trying to move forward in the best way I can." Eleanor nodded, understanding the magnitude of those simple words. It wasn't a reconciliation, not even a renewed friendship, but it was something, a mutual recognition that they were both committed to Matthew's well-being, each in their own way. Later that day, as the house filled with the lively noise of children running, laughing and playing, Robert watched from a corner, with a sense of fulfillment he never imagined feeling again after the collapse of his previous life. Laura, the social worker who had become a family friend, approached with 2 glasses of juice, offering one to him. "To a toast to the birthday boy," she said with a warm smile, "and to the incredible father you've become." Robert accepted the toast but shook his head modestly. "I haven't done anything extraordinary, Laura. I just tried to be present, to give him what he needed. And that is extraordinary," she insisted, "especially considering everything you were facing yourself. I remember the man I met at the hospital a year ago, devastated, scared, guilty. Look at you now." Robert followed her gaze, which was directed at Matthew. The boy was at the center of a circle of friends, telling a story with animated gestures, his face lit with joy and confidence. In a corner of the room, Eleanor was chatting amicably with some of the other mothers, integrated into the environment in a way that would have seemed impossible months ago. "It wasn't all my doing," Robert acknowledged. "I had help. From you, from Dr. Beatrice, From the New Beginnings program, from so many people who showed up when we needed them most. That's a lesson too, isn't it? Laura replied thoughtfully. Learning to accept help, to trust that we don't have to carry everything alone. Her words resonated deeply. For Robert, who had always prided himself on his self-sufficiency, on his ability to solve problems alone, this had perhaps been the hardest lesson, to recognize his own vulnerability, to allow himself to be supported, to understand that true strength wasn't in isolation, but in connection. Time passed quickly, and soon it was time to sing Happy Birthday. Matthew, standing before the cake with 8 candles, seemed to absorb the positive energy from everyone around him. When it came time to make a wish, he closed his eyes tightly, in intense concentration, before blowing out the candles. Later, as the guests began to leave, and the apartment gradually returned to its usual tranquility, Matthew approached his father with a curious expression. "Dad, can I tell you what my birthday wish was?" "But isn't it a secret? They say if you tell, it won't come true," Robert replied with a smile. "This one doesn't have to be a secret," the boy insisted. "I wished that we would stay like this, happy, like today." The simplicity of the wish moved Robert deeply. Happiness, something so elementary, so fundamental, and yet so elusive, something he had sought in possessions, status, appearances, without ever truly finding it. And now, against all odds, after losing almost everything he had once valued, it was here, present in this small apartment, in this simple life rebuilt from scratch. "That's a great wish, son," he said, hugging Matthew tightly. "Sos, and we'll do our best to make it come true every day." 2 months after the birthday, on a cool Saturday morning, Robert was surprised by an unexpected call. It was the director of human resources from a large national corporation, interested in hiring his services as a consultant. Not only that, they wanted him to lead a new division focused specifically on post-crisis business reconstruction. "Your name came with the highest recommendations, Mr. Mitchell Key," the executive explained. "Your personal experience with bankruptcy and rebuilding, combined with your technical expertise, is exactly what we're looking for." The offer was generous, a salary 3 times his current one, benefits, profit sharing, an opportunity to return to the high-level corporate world he had left behind. "I need a few days to think about it," Robert replied cautiously. In the days that followed, he carefully weighed the pros and cons. The money would be welcome, certainly. He could offer Matthew more comfort, ensure an excellent education, maybe even buy a larger house with a yard where his son could play. But the new position would also mean more work hours, more responsibilities, less time at home, a return to the lifestyle that in part had contributed to the problems of the past. One night, after putting Matthew to bed, Robert was in the living room, still pondering the decision, when he received a message from Eleanor. "Can I call? I need to tell you something important." Intrigued, he agreed. Minutes later, the phone rang. "I received a job offer in Princeton," she said, without preamble. "A research project at Princeton University related to child psychology. It's an incredible opportunity. But it would mean moving there." "And you're worried about the visits with Matthew?" Robert completed, understanding immediately. "Yes. Princeton isn't that far. I can come on weekends, but it would no longer be possible to maintain the current routine of weekday visits." Robert thought for a moment. "Do you want this job?" "Very much," she admitted. "It's a chance to do something meaningful, to use my own experience to help other families. But Matthew comes first, always. If you think the move will harm him—" "I think he'll understand," Robert replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Matthew has already shown an incredible ability to adapt, and it would be good for him to see you following a positive path, building something new." The relief in Eleanor's voice was palpable. "Thank you, Robert. I'll talk to him next weekend, explain everything calmly." After hanging up, Robert remained seated in the dark living room, reflecting on how life continued to transform, to flow in unexpected directions. Eleanor rebuilding her professional life in a new city, himself facing a similar crossroads, and Matthew, at the center of it all, moving forward with a resilience that never ceased to amaze him. The next morning, Robert called the HR director and politely declined the offer. Instead, he proposed an alternative. He could work as an independent consultant on specific projects, maintaining the flexible schedule that had become so important in his new life. "I understand your priorities, Mr. Mitchell," the executive replied after a moment of reflection. "And, frankly, I respect that. Let's explore this alternative model you're suggesting." Weeks later, on a sunny afternoon, Robert, Matthew, and Eleanor were together at LaGuardia Airport. It was the day of her move to Princeton, and Matthew had insisted on saying goodbye in person. "I'm going to miss you, Mum," the boy said, hugging her tightly. "Me too, my love," Eleanor replied, emotional. "But I'll be here every weekend, I promise. And during the holidays, you can spend a few days with me in Princeton. There's an amazing science park there that you'll love." Robert watched the scene with a mix of emotions. It was strange to see Eleanor leave, even after everything. For so long, she had been a constant presence in his life, first as a wife, then as an antagonist, and now as... what exactly? There was no clear term to define what they were now. Co-parents, perhaps, people who shared a complex history and an unconditional love for the same child. "Good luck, Eleanor," he said, when it was his turn to say goodbye. "I hope you find what you're looking for." "Thank you," she replied with a sincere smile. "For everything, Robert. For not giving up on me when it would have been easier. For giving Matthew the chance to have a mother, even after—" "He deserves it," Robert interrupted gently. "And you also deserve the chance to start over, to do something meaningful." As Eleanor walked away towards the boarding gate, Robert felt Matthew squeeze his hand tightly. "Is she going to be okay, Dad?" "Yes, she will, son. Your mom is stronger than she looks, like you." On the way home, Matthew was thoughtful, looking out the car window at the city rushing by. "Dad," he said suddenly, "do you think we should move too?" The question took Robert by surprise. "Move? Why? Don't you like our apartment?" "I like it," Matthew replied hesitantly. "But it's just, everything is changing, isn't it? Mom going to Princeton, you with your new consulting work. I thought maybe we needed a new place too." Robert reflected on his son's words, realizing the wisdom in them. Matthew was right. Everything was changing. Life continued to flow, to transform, to open new paths. Maybe it was time to consider a new place, a space that better reflected the family they had become. "You know, Matthew, I think you're right," he said finally. "Maybe it's time we look for a place that's truly ours, not an apartment we rented out of necessity, but a home we choose to build together. What do you think?" Matthew's smile was answer enough. In the weeks that followed, father and son embarked on the adventure of finding a new home. They visited houses and apartments in different neighborhoods, discussing the pros and cons of each. For Robert, it was important that Matthew actively participate in the choice. After all, it wasn't just a change of address, but a symbol of the new phase they were starting together. Finally, they found the perfect place, a small but cozy house in the Forest Hills neighborhood of Queens, with a backyard where Matthew could play, close to a park and good schools. The price was within what Robert could afford, especially now that his independent consulting work was beginning to thrive. On moving day down, as furniture was arranged and boxes were unpacked, Matthew ran from one room to another, excited about every detail of the new space. Robert watched him with a full heart, marveling at his son's ability to find joy in the simplest things. "Dad, come see," the boy called from the back porch. "There's a huge tree in the yard. Can we build a tree house?" "Of course we can, champ," Robert replied, joining him. "We'll build it together. How about that? I can teach you how to use real tools." Matthew's eyes shone with enthusiasm. "Really? Like a father-son project?" "Exactly like that. A father-son project." As they planned the future treehouse together, discussing materials, designs, and possibilities, Robert reflected on the extraordinary journey they had traveled, from a mansion in Greenwich to an apartment in Astoria, and now to this simple house in Forest Hills. From material wealth to bankruptcy, and now to a modest but genuine stability. From a family of appearances to a near tragedy, and now to this new, complex but functional arrangement, where love for their son was the central axis around which everything revolved. It wasn't a perfect story, nor a fairy tale happy ending. There were scars that would never completely fade, painful memories that sometimes surfaced at the most unexpected moments. There were challenges ahead: Matthew's adjustment to a new school, Eleanor's less frequent visits, the inevitable ups and downs of life. But there was also a deep certainty, which Robert now carried like an internal compass. True value was never in the possessions, the status, the appearances that had guided him so much in the past. It was in the moments of genuine connection, in the ability to be present for those we love, in the courage to rebuild when all seems lost. "Dad," Matthew called, interrupting his thoughts. "The treehouse is going to be our secret place, just ours." "Okay." "Perfect, son," Robert replied, smiling. "Our secret place, our little refuge." And as the sun began to set over the garden of their new home, illuminating his son's face with a golden light, Robert knew they had finally found the true meaning of home. Not an address, not a physical structure, but that feeling of belonging, of safety, of unconditional love that, against all odds, they had managed to preserve and strengthen. It wasn't the end of the story, of course. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter they would write together, word by word, day by day, building not just a treehouse, but a whole life of moments that truly mattered. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Robert and Matthew has touched your hearts and shown how, even in the most difficult times, the love between a father and son can overcome any obstacle. For more moving stories like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Share with us in the comments which city you're watching from and what part of the story moved you the most. Each week, we bring new narratives that explore the complexity of human relationships and the ability to start anew. Your support motivates us to continue creating content that moves and inspires. Until the next story.